Want to show your support for your Philly teams? Check out phillygoat.com. They have all of your needs covered, whether it's Sixers, Flyers, Eagles, Phillies, Union, Philly boxing, Philly culture, or Philly pride. There's something for you. Tees, hoodies, hats, any color you want, any size you want, including kids. Go to phillygoat.com. Use the promo code Jim Montgomery for 10% off your order. That's phillygoat.com. Be sure it has the authentic goat on the sleeve, and use that promo code Jim Montgomery for 10% off of your order. What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane. I'm your host, Jim Montgomery, episode 54. Thank you for joining us. Another great episode here at Back to the Future. As you know, this is the longer form podcast I do that takes a deeper dive into Philly sports history. We have This Day in Philly Sports History, which is the daily, just that. We take a look at what happened this day in Philly sports history, take a look at the current affairs and current state of the Philly sports teams, give our takes on that. And then we like to do something fun each month. This month we've been having fun with Who Wore It Best. Be sure to tune in every day. Best way to stay in the loop, because there's some good things and big things coming on the horizon very soon, is to like and subscribe. That way, no matter what, you are in the loop as to what's going on. If you have not done so already, please listen to last week's episode, or watch if you're a YouTube person. We sat down with Ken Avalon of the Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame and just had a lot of fun. He's the president and one of the co-founders. As we're prepping for this year's induction class, which is in November, which happens to be the Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame 20th induction class. They also have their 20th sport going in, so they've been doing a lot with 20 for 20. We will be highlighting some of those 20 for 20s, as I mentioned earlier in the summer, as well as taking a deeper dive into the induction class on This Day in Philly sports history. So be sure to tune into that as we get closer to November. But like I said, I got some big things lined up in the next couple weeks, so stay tuned for that. All right. So Flyers training camp opens up this week, and admittedly, I've said it 1,000 times, I'm not as big and up to date and really up on the history of the Flyers as much as I am the other sports. And it is something I'm consciously trying to work on. If you listen to This Day in Philly sports history, I've been giving a lot of updates on the Flyers, gave my take on Danny Briere, and really just following what's going on with them. So with the opening of their training camp this week and tying in, and you're going to see one of the things I do have planned, there's going to be a little bit more overlap between This Day in Philly sports history as well as Back to the Future. So you might hear something on This Day in Philly sports history and then see a longer form of it on Back to the Future. And I've mentioned that a couple times where like that would be a good topic for Back to the Future. So I always take notes and following through on that. So in September, we've been doing, as I mentioned, the Who Wore It Best. And one of the, maybe not so much the best of the numbers we've had, but number 4 came up, and Lenny Dykstra did win number 4. But there's an interesting one that through my research, I learned kind of more about his story, and I wasn't necessarily as aware of the story as I guess I should have. And that's number 4, Barry Ashbee. I didn't know much about him. I always saw his number hanging up in the rafters at the Wells Fargo Center and just assumed he was another one of the Broad Street Bullies, sort of one of those good old boy Flyer guys. Not maybe as well known as like a Bobby Clark or Bill Barber or Bernie Perrant. Excuse me, the guys that you always see and hear when you think about those old school Flyers teams, but never really thought twice about it. And then as I'm like, okay, Barry Ashbee, he's one of the representatives for the number 4. His number is retired. Let me kind of know a little bit more about him, find out how it got there. I know his number's retired, but why? How, like, what was his contribution to the team? And as usually is the case when I start doing research for either podcast, which is probably part of the reason why, if you've noticed, I've always make it a point to know that my information is legit and accurate, and I will correct it if not, because I spend a lot of time researching it. But in this case, I fell down a rabbit hole with Barry Ashbee. And after doing the research, and again, if you know his story, then you know sort of where we're going to go with this on this podcast. If you don't, to me, I wanted to take a few minutes and really spend some time and highlight this guy's life. Because it's a great message. And on this day in Philly sports history, I do the positivity and the motivational Tuesdays. And I just felt that this deserved more than a couple minutes on a Tuesday. So I wanted to give him a full Back to the Future episode because that's how great his message is. And like I said, this is just going to be a positive, motivational type podcast as we go through the life and career of Barry Ashbee. And for those of you who did listen this week to This Day in Philly Sports History, if you're a member of the Channel 10 team, hit me up. I'm more than willing to share. Just give me some shout outs or credits or something. Have me on for whatever you got to do. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, they had a thing with Sheila Watko, who did Positive Tuesday in Philly, where they highlighted something positive in Philly. And I'm like, that is my whole shtick I've done since the beginning of This Day in Philly sports history. So if you know somebody at Channel 10, just tell them to give me some credit and have me on. I would love to be right next to Bill and Keith in the morning during my, hey, on this day, this is what happened. But I digress. Back to Barry Ashbee and just kind of his life and just so much. And he was born in Weston, Ontario. And as most kids are in Canada, especially that area in Ontario, was a big hockey player, played junior hockey, ironically enough, for a team called the Barrie Flyers. Apparently, from what I was able to read and research, he was he's a solid player. Like he could skate, which I think sometimes with hockey players, if you've ever seen Happy Gilmore, you can be the best, have the best shot, but if you can't skate. So he could skate, but he was slow, but just nothing spectacular. Just like a solid, okay, he's not going to hurt you there. From the Barrie Flyers, he went on to the EPHL, which is now a defunct league. And he played there for 3 years, but he did do enough there where he caught the attention of the Hershey Bears. And again, if you're seeing a lot of these just, wow, this is ironic, I thought the same thing. I'm like, well, the Hershey Bears I knew were one of the minor league affiliates of the Flyers. They played in the AHL, and they were one of the best teams in the AHL. And I think what I didn't realize and what's important to know is they weren't affiliated necessarily with the NHL at the time, because at that point in the late 60s, it was still like mid to late 60s, I should say. The NHL was still just the original six. So the AHL was sort of like that next level down league. But when he played in the AHL, he was a hard worker and quickly became one of the best defensemen in the AHL. And it was there that he caught the eye of the Boston Bruins, who he signed there. But again, since there was only 6 teams, it was hard to, I guess they did sort of like the two-way contracts that the NBA does with the G League. So he was under contract by the Hershey Bears, but the Bruins had him, and basically he didn't make the team. He just had to wait for an injury or something to happen, which, as fate would have it, it did happen in 1965, and he was called up. Realizing his dream, as most kids in Canada dreamed of, he was playing in the NHL, albeit not for one of the Canadian teams. It was for Boston, but he realized his dream, or so he thought. And this is where the motivation and everything comes in. So as we go through, you're going to see let me just finish the story and then you'll see. But realized his dream of going to the NHL, found out he was playing with a crushed disc in his back. Not like a herniated or this, that, a crushed disc. So think about that. Like, think about a bone that's crushed and then have it be crushed in your back. Obviously, he needed back surgery, only played 14 games for the Bruins, and ultimately, most people would have been like, all right, well, I played 14 games in the NHL. I need back surgery. Well, he was in the hospital for 6 weeks, and he wasn't even sure if he was going to walk again, let alone go back to the NHL. So it's like, hey, I worked hard. Had a cup of coffee in the league. I'm good. I just hope I can walk again. So he was on the road to recovery, missed the rest of, obviously, that NHL season and all of the next season, which was 1966-67. And the Bruins coach, Harry Sinden, didn't like it. And basically called him out, said he was milking the injury, that he's faking, he just doesn't want to play, blah, 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 blah. Basically all the things that people would say back then. Nowadays, you couldn't necessarily get away with saying things like that because of the union and CBAs and things like that. But basically, because he felt he was milking it, he buried him in the minors and said, you're never going to play in the NHL again, at least not for the Boston Bruins. Obviously, he admitted later on in his life that he made a mistake. And it's like, well, no crap, you made a mistake. But buried in the minors, but he still had played well, was one of the best defensemen in the AHL, made it to the minor leagues, or the NHL, before he got injured. So he was hoping, as the NHL decided they were going to expand 6 teams, basically double the league, he was like, okay, I have to be able to make one of these teams. I have experience. This is an expansion team. I could be a good leader. All those things that you think when you're trying to make it to the big leagues. And he wasn't selected. He was passed on by all 6 teams in the expansion draft. He was 28 years old and essentially had, for the most part, at that point, it's like, I have no shot of ever getting back to the league and anything like that. Still, he went back. He enjoyed playing hockey. He was good in the AHL, went back to playing at Hershey. And finally, I guess because of the proximity and the way the league was changing, general manager of the Flyers, Keith Allen, and head coach Vic Stasiak said, you know what, let's give him a chance. I mean, and they were not, they were okay. They just weren't the Flyers that they were before. So finally, at age 31 in 1970, he got back to the NHL. Well, as most people probably would be at the age of 30, you kind of slummed around in the minor leagues, know that you were good enough to make it to the NHL back when there was only 6 teams, and now you're finally making it back with 12. He had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, and rightfully so. So he came into that training camp, and there were basically Gene Hart, the Flyers announcer, basically said he didn't smile. He kind of kept to himself and was just very focused on making the team. And I guess rightfully so. I mean, you have that taste, and it was your dream to do. You want to get back there and make the team. So he played well enough throughout training camp. He did make the team, and almost immediately he made an impact. He became one of the best defensemen on the team, and he became the point on the power play because he was the only right-handed shooter they had. So he played, obviously, a very important a role for the team, and he was a little bit older, and he just played hard. And then after Stasiak left, Fred Shero came in and immediately fell in love with him. He loved his toughness. He was a competitor. And if you know Fred Shero, he's the guy that really, obviously the general manager helped build that team. But Fred Shero is the one that sort of gave them that Broad Street bully sort of mentality. So you have a tough guy like Barry Ashbee, Shero is going to love him. And I mean, this is the kind of dude Barry Ashbee was like, and I have to laugh at this because I could not imagine anything. Not one part of this story seems believable, especially today. But he was such a competitor that Referee gave him a penalty. I don't even know what it was for. Ashbee got pissed off, knocked the referee out, literally punched him in the face, knocked him out. And if that part of the story isn't unbelievable enough, he was only suspended for 8 games and he was fined $150. Now, could you imagine what would happen if anybody in any of the sports punched and knocked out a referee or an umpire? I mean, the other night on Monday Night Football, it was a big deal because Deshaun Watson touched the referee, let alone punching him and then knocking him out. So 8 games and $150 fine for knocking out the referee. So again, this is the kind of player he was. Fred Shero loved him. Going into the 72-73 season, injuries started creeping up on him again. Basically, his knee was shot. The kneecap was basically, they said, deteriorating, which if that doesn't sound painful enough, he had no ligaments really either. His ligaments were non-existent. So doesn't sound like it's a very like at that point, most people would have been just like, all right, I'm not going to be able to come back for this. Oh, yeah. And then you throw in the fact that he had neck, shoulder, and elbow pain. And the reason I love this story and I love the whole aspect of Barry Ashbee is he's like, screw it. I'm living my dream. I want to win a Stanley Cup now. I've played a couple years in the NHL. I want to win a Stanley Cup. And despite the fact that he was injured and had so many, just one of those injuries, I think, would have been enough to put me on my butt. But the fact that he had a deteriorating kneecap, basically no ligaments in his knee, his neck was messed up, his shoulder was messed up, his elbow was messed up, he's like, screw it. I mean, he was tough. And Bobby Clark even said he's the strongest guy mentally that he has ever seen. And we talk a lot, and you see it all the time, that hockey players are tough. But Barry Ashbee made the toughest hockey player you can think of seem like a punk. That's how tough he was. And he realized that he was getting older. He realized that he had injuries. And heading into that 72-73 season, he went and said, I want traded. He's like, I don't want to be on a team with these losers, basically. He said they don't want to win. They are not really putting in the effort and trying to get better. Basically, he pulled a Murtaugh from Lethal Weapon and said, I'm too old for this shit. And ultimately said, trade me or I'm just going to retire. Somehow they talked him into staying, and the team realized that, you know what, we need a shift in mindset. We need a shift in sort of just attitude and things like that, and overhauled the roster. Brought in some more of the tough guy defensemen. They brought in guys to play along Bobby Clark and basically overhauled everything, and then things started to change. And you have like your de facto leader there, the guy that's like, I want to win a Stanley Cup. I expect I'm holding myself to this sort of expectation and whatnot. I expect you to hold yourself to the same standard. And I think when you see a guy playing through that much pain, a guy that is that driven and wants to win that bad, it raises the expectations and the standard of everybody else. Think about like Jalen Hurts, how they all talk about how they don't want to let each other down. And I think once you have a leader and somebody who sort of sets that standard, that's what everybody does. And that's what Barry Ashbee did for those Flyers. And once he said, listen, he put his foot down and drew a line in the sand and said, trade me or I'm retiring or make this better. And ultimately the Flyers said, you know what? They were self-reflective on it and said, yeah, we need to get better. And at that point, the sky was the limit. They got so much better in that 72-73 season, brought in Bernie Parent for the 73-74 season, and we kind of know what happened. But for Barry Ashbee, I think it was a very motivating thing for him to see the Flyers really trying. And it goes back to, okay, I put my line here in the sand. Now everybody else is reaching that standard. I need to up my game. And that's basically what he did. And then he got snubbed for the All-Star game, despite the fact that the first half of the 73-74 season was hands down his best season as a pro. He didn't make the All-Star game and should have. And he took it. We've all seen the meme with Michael Jordan from The Last Dance, and I took that personally. Well, Barry Ashbee took that personally and just unleashed the league. He got pissed off and made the rest of the league play. He had a plus-minus rating of plus 52 that year. And then everybody took notice at the end of the year. He was named second team NHL All-Star. He was the All-Western Conference team. All while playing through, we talked about his injuries with the knee and everything, but he also had a chip disc in his back, or I guess the upper part of his neck, I guess it was. So to the point where he just was sort of numb all the time and could barely grip his stick. He had bursitis on his elbow, a pinched nerve, had to wear a horse collar like they do in the NFL. Like I said, could barely grip his stick. And, I mean, his back was so jacked up, he couldn't even bend down to tie his skates. But he had one goal in mind. He was focused on winning that Stanley Cup and just played through it. And, I mean, I don't know back then what happened, whether they were shooting him up with cortisone or what. I'd imagine they probably were. But either way, to go through all those injuries, he didn't want to leave his teammates down, but he had that dream of winning the cup. And you got to admire that. A guy that is so focused and so driven that he didn't want to leave his teammates down, and he also just wanted to play. So going into that playoff round, he played very well in the first round series over Atlanta. The Flyers didn't really have any problem. Stanley Cup Conference semifinals, they played the Rangers. Game 4 was sent into overtime. The Rangers ended up winning that game to tie that series. But in overtime, he was hit in the face with a puck right above his eyelid, sort of in between the eyelid and where, I guess, your eyebrow is, they said. And he was obviously in pain, and it was weird because, like, I watched the video of it, the aftermath of it, and the sideline reporter for the NHL, for the Flyers, I guess, once there was a stoppage in play, he's out there on the ice with a little box and like headphones on, reporting live, talking to the referee, and the ref just described it, and he said there was blood everywhere. Took him to the hospital. Unfortunately, due to hemorrhaging behind the eye, it caused damage to his retina, which ultimately led him to go partially blind in that eye, unfortunately ending his career. Now, we know how the rest of that season sort of played out, and the Flyers won the Stanley Cup, and basically Ashbee was like this. He was like, listen, don't think of me as a tragedy. Don't feel sorry for me. I am happy. My name is going on that cup. And that's ultimately all he ever wanted, was to get his name on the Stanley Cup, and he got it. And if the story ended there, that would be a happy, motivational story. But it's not over yet. There's more. So he was doing okay for himself. But the Flyers asked him to be a coach because of how much he meant to the team, how much he worked to help get those guys over the hump. More so for his just knowledge of the game and his leadership, more so than anything. And at first he said no, and he had to be talked into it because he thought it was basically a charity offer. And as you can tell from before, he's like, don't think of me as a charity case. My name's on the Stanley Cup. I'm good. Don't offer me a job just because, like, I don't want to be like a dog and pony or anything. He's like, no, I don't want to be a charity case. Well, ultimately, Fred Shero, and during my research, I found out he was one of the first coaches to implement and have assistant coaches. So he wanted him to be one of his assistant coach, finally convinced and talked him into it, and he became sort of the coach, de facto defensive coordinator, I guess you would call it. I know they don't have that in the NHL, but he coached the defensemen. And even though he had played with a lot of those guys just the year before, he commanded their respect. And again, if you think about the beginning part of that story, the fact that he set the standard for those guys and they respected him enough to raise their games, it makes sense that he was going to be a good coach. And then throw in his knowledge of the game, the leadership that he was capable of, and ultimately he embraced it and became a good coach. At one point, I read that he was basically eventually going to be the chosen one to take over for Fred Shiro when Fred Shiro finally retired. Like, he was sort of the head coach in waiting. And that's just the kind of guy he was. He never wanted any accolades. He just wanted to make guys better and wanted to win. They did finally talk to have, because he retired and tragically had to retire, he did have a Barry Ashbee night one night, reluctantly. He didn't want to do it, but he said, okay, if it makes everybody else happy, I'll do it. But he was more focused on his coaching duties, and they went out and he won they won the Stanley Cup the next year. So Barry Ashbee won the cup again, got to have his name on the Stanley Cup once as a player, once as a coach. They went out in the third year and they got to the Stanley Cup Finals before losing. But again, if the story ended there, it would be great. Unfortunately, there is another chapter. In April 77, right before that third year, the playoff run started, he was diagnosed with leukemia. Battled hard, wanted to fight it. Ultimately, the chemo didn't work. Cancer spread to, I believe it was his liver, one of his organs. And he battled, and he said, I'm going to beat this. I'm going to fight it. The night before he died, even, he looked at his wife and said, I'm tired. I'm going to go to sleep, but I'm going to wake up tomorrow. I'm going to keep fighting. Unfortunately, he never did wake up. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. But on May 12th, 1977, he passed away at age 37 due to the complications of the leukemia. And, I mean, it's a tragic way for this story to end, especially after how much he fought and how much he went through to even get to that point. But ultimately, he just couldn't defeat the cancer. But his legacy still continues to live on. So Ed Snyder, God rest his soul, wanted to make sure that Barry Ashbee's story sort of endured. Very similar to the reason why I'm telling you guys this now. I'm like, I feel like this story needed to be told because I didn't know it. I'm 44 and lived in this area, huge Philly sports fan my entire life. I never knew the story of Barry Ashbee. And I don't know why. Like, this is such an incredible story. We've already talked about it. That Ed Snyder and the Flyers retired his number 4 number. They all wore number 4 patches that next year. One thing that I thought was really cool that, again, I didn't know, the year before was before he passed away, was the first Flyers Wives Fight for Life Carnival. He actually worked it, and it was like a great success that they continued to do it the next year. Well, that following year and every subsequent year after that, that carnival is dedicated to the memory of him, and a large portion of the proceeds from the Flyers Fight for Lives Carnival goes to leukemia and blood disease research. So in that respect, outside of his motivational story of hockey and finally overcoming everything and winning the Stanley Cup, not once, but also doing it as a coach, that again, if that was the story, what a great story. But the fact now that his memory and his legacy lives on through the fundraising and the donations to leukemia and other blood disease research, that to me is far more, makes more of a difference in the grand scheme of things to everybody than just the motivational aspect of it. And I'm not taking anything away from the motivational aspect. It's just amazing. So all of that, like, what a rich legacy for him. You have the motivation, like, keep fighting, keep believing, don't give up. That story. You have and I'm getting chills again, but the fact that the proceeds and his memory lives on through the donations to the Leukemia Foundation and things like that, that is great. And at the end of the day, here's what's crazy. He only played 4 years for the Flyers, 270 games, scored a total of 82 points. Yet I venture and dare to say that his legacy and his impact on the organization and just the people of this area, the city of Philadelphia, the whole entire region, probably is more important than Bobby Clark, than Bernie Perrant, than Bill Barber, than Fred Shiro, than any of those guys who were big-time members of those Stanley Cup teams. I mean, the man was a legend, both on the ice, off the ice. I mean, it's, again, what a story. I mean, what a legacy. I felt very strongly in doing my research that this story needed to get out there. If it's something that you already know or knew, I apologize. Maybe there's something that I added that you didn't know, but I would be willing to bet that for most of the audience out there, a lot of you did not know this and probably were in a very similar situation as me. And I just felt very, very strongly once I really did the research on this that this story needed to go out there. So please be sure to share this podcast with somebody, and not even for me to grow the podcast, just to get that message out there, to get that story. Maybe somebody needs to hear it to get motivated to do something. Maybe somebody will want to donate money or whatever. Just get this story out here. We can learn so much from Barry Ashbee that he represents what hard work and perseverance means and can do, represents what holding yourself to a high standard can do. It just shows living your life the right way, doing the right thing, making the right decisions, what that can mean. And to me, this is what this podcast is about, and it's kind of what I want to shift to. I want to get stories like this out there. There's so many stories in Philly sports, and if you listen to the interview last week with Ken, he said there's so many of those non-mainstream sports stars out there that had an impact on people that because they didn't play in the Big Four, their story is untold. So that's sort of one of the directions, and I don't have any, that's not part of the big news I have, but that's one of the directions I want to have. I want to get some of those lesser known stories out there. And Barry Ashbee played one of the Big Four sports. He just wasn't one of the big guys on one of the most important Flyers teams ever. But his story, I'd put it up there with any of them. And maybe like I said, maybe some of you knew this story, maybe some of you didn't, but I felt that it warranted repeating and getting out there. And as I said, I really want to root for the Flyers more this year and really expand my Flyers knowledge and be able to bring, if I had to grade myself on the Big Four, the Flyers obviously are my weak point, and I want to really work on strengthening that. And I really want to trust their process this year, to borrow a line from the Sixers, because they are in the middle of a rebuild, and they are in a time of change for them. But after hearing this story, it's got me so pumped up that I want to love the Flyers, and hopefully maybe it gives you motivated for NHL too. If you can and if you want to, give to the Flyers charities or the Leukemia Lymphoma Society in honor of Barry Ashbee. You can look either the Flyers charity, Google them, or look up the Leukemia Lymphoma Society if you feel so moved to do so. I know I'm going to, just because I feel like because of the way he lived his life, that's the least I can do. And it's just a very motivating thing. As I'm getting tears in my eyes just kind of thinking about it, it's just an amazing thing. Be sure to check out things at the Philly Sports Hall of Fame. Barry Ashbee should be in the Philly Sports Hall of Fame if he's not in already. And I'll be honest, I need to look at it. I probably should have done it beforehand. If he's not, let's nominate him. Let's make a movement to get him in there for a contributor. But go to their main site, phillyhall.org. Or if you want to learn more about this year's induction class, or to buy tickets. I will be buying a ticket. I haven't decided which level, whether I'm going to buy for the meet and greet beforehand or just the dinner and the ceremony. But buy your tickets now before they sell out at the Philadelphia Sports Hall. Go to PhiladelphiaSportsHallOfFame.org. That's where you find everything you need to know about this year's induction class. Be sure to listen to This Day in Philly Sports History every day. where we go dive into this day in Philly sports history. You're not going to get a story this in depth there, but that's why you come to Back to the Future. I told you we've been doing Who Wore It Best in September. In October, we're going to look at the 2023 Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame inductees. Take a look at that 20 for 20. As I mentioned on Back to the Future, I want to start going into some of the stories of some of the unsung heroes and things like that. As always, leave a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. Did this move you? What do you think about Barry Ashbee? Did you know this story? Was it a repeat? Any interaction helps, and that could be part of my big news. So stay tuned for that. Best way to do it, like and subscribe to the podcast. Tell everybody. Tell somebody about it. Follow me on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Jimbo_Mott, Instagram @PhillyJimbo. Thank you very much for listening. Barry Ashbee, may you rest in peace. You serve as a motivation for all of us. We can all do better. We can all be good people. So thank you for helping us realize that. Go have yourselves a week. Hopefully the Eagles can win on Monday night. Tune in again next week for more Back to the Future. I'm Jim Montgomery, and until next time, I will see you when I see you. The Clashing Conferences podcast is a football conference-specific podcast that brings together the everyday passion of real fans and their not-so-friendly friends for the purpose of real-life football entertainment. Aggressive but friendly competitiveness is the name of the game as this group of NFC East fans jabs and banters each other trying to prove their pointless points. With an internal competition within for weekly and end-of-the-season bragging rights, watch as this group will still boast and brag even when their teams fail to bring home the W. New episodes drop on Thursday, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.